Okay, so welcome everyone to the first of the Newcastle Youth Studies Network's online seminars for 2021. And this one is on gendered experiences of the work education nexus in the COVID era. So we have three really great speakers and some really interesting research to look at. And the format that we're going to use is the same as last year for those that were there then. Basically, we'll have a speaker talk about the research for about 20 minutes, and then I'll take a question from the chat. So please open up the chat and put stuff up there if you want it to be aired as a question. And then we'll move on to the next one, and we'll do that 3 times. And then hopefully we have about 15 minutes at the end to have lots of questions and discussion from the chat that I'll direct to the different speakers. So we're going to begin with Jenny Chester from the University of Melbourne. And Jenny is going to present her research on understanding the persistence of economic inequality, how gender attitudes shape young women's occupational aspirations in Germany. Thanks, Jenny. Do you want to share your screen now?
Yep. Sorry.
No.
Whoa. Sorry. I just have to. Sorry, I didn't realize that it was going to come up in the wrong place.
And I'll just quickly say that anyone in the audience that's not muted, please mute.
Sorry about that. Okay. And I also have to apologise because I will have to leave early because I'm tutoring at 6:15. So I'll have to duck off early. Okay, so as you know, women are more likely to have higher levels of education than men. That's the same in Australia and most of Europe, the US, UK and Germany, which is the country I'm looking at the moment. The reason I'm looking at Germany is because I had the opportunity to access a file that had the percentage of men and women in about 300 different occupations. So that made this paper easy to do. I haven't done that work in Australia, but I hope to be doing that next. As we know also that when women are concentrated in female-dominated occupations, they typically have lower levels of earning and lower levels of status. And there's a whole lot of literature about occupational sex segregation and why that's the case. So I'll be looking at some of that. Because of the expansion of the service sector, there's more women in the workforce. A lot of care work is now being marketised. So there's jobs there the women choose or get allocated to. I prefer to use the word allocated. And this is sort of exacerbated the segregation of men and women. There's not too many service sector jobs, particularly for low-skilled people, that are what we would say male type jobs. And even though women are more likely to be in the labour force now, it hasn't really alleviated their secondary nature of women's employment. Women tend to have part-time jobs to fit in with their family responsibilities. So in Germany, as you probably are aware, there's a very strong relationship between the education system and the labour market. And there's also the persistence of the male breadwinner model. Even when women are working, they're regarded as a secondary earner. So women are either secondary earners or homemakers. The occupational sex segregation is very entrenched in Germany, more so than in other Western countries. Part of this is because the education system is sex segregated. Of course, if young people take the academic pathway, or if they're allowed to take the academic pathway, in Germany, secondary school starts after the age of 10 in the 5th grade, And already students in the 5th grade are allocated to different tracks. So I'm particularly looking at people who haven't been allocated to the academic track, but I do include all students in this research. If we look at the vocational training track, there's 2 types of tracks in Germany. There's the firm-based apprenticeships and there's the school-based programs. The firm-based apprenticeships combine school and paid work. It's typically male-dominated, and even though they're called apprenticeships, they're not the same as Australian apprenticeships, which are typically heavily dominated by the manual trades. In Germany, there's also apprenticeships in commercial, retail, and the administration sectors. The school-based apprenticeships are female-dominated, and they're preparing young people for personal service occupations such as nurses and social workers. This is another difference in Germany. Nurses and social workers do not go to university. They are trained in school. So selecting pathways into female-dominated occupations is tied to, I would argue, attitudes to gender roles. And so in this paper, I'm looking at this sort of the nexus, I guess, but the relationship between gender attitudes and occupations. So when we're looking at occupational sex segregation, there's 2 types, horizontal and vertical. Horizontal sex segregation is when men and women work in different occupations. So this is typically related to gender stereotypes. This is because some occupations require soft skills such as nurturing and caring, and it's stereotypically regarded as more suitable for women. Occupations requiring physical strength or technical abilities are seen as being more suitable for men. In Australia, it's not quite as dominant. There's a fair bit of slippage happening. Even when I was walking down the street today, I'd see that there are women in their high vis holding the lollipop signs telling me when I can walk or not walk in the construction zone. So women are making some headway into some of the jobs that we typically see for men. But in Germany, it's far less common. Vertical sex segregation is when men have higher status jobs than women. So even in nursing, you might find that the nurse manager is the male and the registered nurses are female. Underpinning vertical sex segregation is gender essentialism. And this theory argues that men are more worthy of status than women. Therefore, they should have the jobs that have authority. This is from Charles and Grosky's work since 2004. And there's not anyone who can really argue against that, even though that was written some time ago. As we know, male-dominated occupations have high levels of pay, they have more employment-related benefits, and there's always more opportunities for promotion. Another perspective that underpins why men and women are segregated into different occupations is Western Zimmerman's Doing Gender. They argue that gender is an accomplishment that is produced and reproduced in everyday interactions and activities. So if we look at it from a doing gender perspective, women who have stereotypical attitudes to gender roles will prefer jobs in female-dominated occupations, and the reverse for men. The thing about gender attitudes is it's highly, I would argue, related to the socialization within the family and also within the community. So socialization plays a very integral role. Parents model behaviour, schools model behaviour, children learn what's acceptable through the family and through their schools. In this paper, I'm looking at 3 research questions. The first one is, how do gender attitudes vary according to family characteristics? What are the associations between gender attitudes and occupational aspirations? And what is the association between parents' occupation and students' occupational aspirations? And I'm just going to be looking at young women in this presentation. So the data comes from Germany, from the National Education Panel study, starting cohort 4. This project in Germany has 6 cohorts of participants, but starting cohort 4, were recruited when they were in the 9th grade. There was 545 schools involved all across Germany. I'm looking at data collected from 2010 to 2015, and this is necessary because the occupational aspirations variable question is asked in the year before the students leave school. So students who are in the lower track of school leave after the 9th grade, so they were asked early. Then students who are in the vocational education track leave a year or two later, and then children who are in the academic track leave in the 12th or 13th grade, depending on which state they live in. So there was 5 questions for the gender roles attitude, and that was asked from all students in the 3rd wave. The occupational aspirations were coded into 3 categories: a male occupation, if only 30% people were female; a female occupation, if 70% of the people in that occupation are female; and all the ones in the middle were coded as gender neutral. I also looked at parents' education, parents' occupation, which was coded into the 3 same categories, and migrant status. Migrant status is very important in Germany when you're looking at both gender attitudes, but also occupational aspirations. So I've got the tables at the end, but I just thought I'd talk you through the main findings. What I found was that mothers but not fathers' education was associated with daughters' gender attitudes. I also found that parents' job type wasn't associated with daughters' gender attitudes. So it didn't matter if the mother was working or not. It didn't matter if the mother had a female type job or a gender neutral job. It didn't matter if the father had a male type job or a gender neutral job. It didn't have an effect on gender attitudes of the daughters. However, if it was a migrant family, it did matter, because migrant young women had more traditional gender attitudes. It was also a relationship between having more traditional attitudes and the type of job that girls wanted. So if girls had more traditional gender attitudes, they wanted to have a female type job. Then I looked at father's employment to see whether, if the father was employed in a male type job or a female job, to see whether that affected their occupational aspirations. I also controlled for gender attitudes and migrant status, because I wanted to make sure that it wasn't girls who had more traditional attitudes driving the occupational aspirations. So I control for that, and I just look at the effect for fathers' jobs. And I found that if the father was employed in a gender neutral job, the girl was more likely to have an aspiration for a gender neutral job. And the same for girls if their mothers were employed in gender neutral jobs. Girls of mothers who were employed in male jobs were more likely to want male jobs. So girls were, in a sense, aspiring for occupations that were similar in these 3 categories: female, male, and gender neutral, according to how their parents were working. So in this paper, I looked at family background in 2 measures of family background: parental education and occupation. And I found that this was not strongly associated with gender attitudes. And this is important because attitudes to gender roles are associated with occupational aspirations. I also found that mother's occupation is more important than father's occupation for girls' occupational aspirations, and that there's a strong association between migrant status and attitudes to gender roles. Migrants have more traditional attitudes than non-migrants. What this is saying is that socialization in the home is really a strong predictor of how young women, the sort of jobs that young women are going to aspire for. Parents who model gender atypical behaviour undermine gender stereotypes, and this is important. So because girls who have more traditional attitudes and want jobs that allow them to do gender will be disadvantaged in the long run in the labour market. Having a job that's a female type job means that the girls will be locked into jobs and careers that are generally low status and lower paid. And this will perpetuate the economic disadvantage that's associated with being female. They will become dependent on a male breadwinner because the work that they will be doing will be in female dominated occupations, which are lower paid and lower status. And this means that girls with traditional attitudes to gender roles are going to be less likely to achieve economic independence. So the persistence of sex segregation in the German labour market is strongly tied to the sex segregation of the German secondary school. Unfortunately for girls, when they're in a track, it's very hard to switch. It's the same for boys. Once you're in a particular track, it's very hard to switch. And like I said, these decisions are being made when the child is 10 years old. So there's a lot to be said for the German education system. I am a big fan, apart from one thing, and that is this age of allocating children to a track. Because the tracks through secondary school are gendered, girls typically do school-based training programs, boys typically do firm-based training programs. This is relegating a large proportion of the young people in Germany to sex segregated jobs for the rest of their life. 2/3 of young people in Germany enter the labour market after completing either the school-based program or the apprenticeship program. So it's the majority of young people. Young women are encouraged to embark on vocational pathways, which will support the persistence of the male breadwinner model, where men are regarded as the primary earners and women are regarded as secondary earners or homemakers. This is the acknowledgement for the data. It's supported by the German government. It's an ongoing longitudinal study that started in 2010. I've been to Germany a few times and I've had the opportunity to conduct my analysis of the data in Bamberg. And I also need to acknowledge that a PhD student who was based in Nuremberg that I met, and Kristen Bachmann, actually shared her file with the percentages of males in each occupation. This presentation has a companion article where I actually looked at the relationship between gender attitudes and occupational aspirations for young men in Germany, and that's just been published in Work, Employment and Society. Stop sharing. Is there any questions? Steve, you're on mute.
Sorry, boom a moment. So we do have some questions in the chat. The first one's from Julia Cook. I'm really interested in the early streaming of students into gender-coded tracks. Does data from other countries suggest that non-streamed education leads to more gender egalitarian aspirations? Yeah,
that's exactly why I want to look at the Australian data. When I track down someone who's got a file of 300 occupations in Australia, or if I can find out how to do that myself or get the time to do that myself, I will look at it using the LSA data, the Longitudinal Surveys of Australian Youth, which would work really well for this. And LSA data has 6 or 7 cohorts now, and they track people from age 15 through to about age 25. So I would be able to do it using LSA data. They also collect occupation aspirations and gender attitudes in the first few years. So I would be able to do that. But as you can imagine, time.
Thanks. I might ask you another question because you're not going to be here at the end, so we can just shorten that a little bit. So there's one question about interested to know what theories underpin your study. And there's another one that talks about is lower pay and lower status in female jobs also associated with lower job security? Until recently, I would have assumed so, but recently have become aware of situations in which the higher status jobs seem paradoxically more secure. Sorry, paradoxically less secure.
Yeah, okay, so that's a good question. I mean, the theories that I'm looking at are gender essentialism and doing gender. So for me, the reason why people with traditional attitudes choose male-dominated jobs if they're male or female-dominated jobs if they're female is because they want to do gender. It's part of their understanding of what it is to be a man or what it is to be a woman. So I'm very strongly agreeing with the doing gender. I'm not happy with the gender essentialism. I think it does explain why men are in high status jobs and women aren't. But yeah, it's a bit more difficult. And what was the second question?
Is lower pay and lower status in
yeah.
female jobs also associated with lower job security?
Okay, so a different paper that I looked at this in the gig economy, and I've just done some more work on it now using the life patterns data. Joanna Wynne and I published a paper, and we found that the higher educated people, so people with a master's degree or higher, were less likely to have a permanent job. So they have less job security. But they're more likely to have meaningful work. So they're trading off job security for jobs that they're interested in doing. And I just did some more analysis of life patterns data using a different measure of meaningful work, just to make sure that, you know, it wasn't the measure that I used in a later wave of data. And I found exactly the same thing. So I'm pretty convinced that people with high levels of education are trading off security for interesting work. And that's why academics, I mean, yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
Excellent. Thanks, Jenny. We'll now move on to the next paper, which is going to be presented by Jane Burke. And she's presenting some research she's been doing with Coffey and Stephanie Hardacre. And the paper's titled Rethinking Gender Equity in Higher Education, Exploring the Impact of Gender-Based Violence on University Participation.
Thank you, Steve.
Thanks, Penny.
Can everybody see my screen okay? Great. Okay, well, I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land upon which I'm speaking from, the Awabakal and Worimi people, and pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. And I'd also like to acknowledge Felicity Kokuzoli, who isn't named here, but is part of our research team and is developing feminist arts-based workshops as part of our project. So I'm going to go through the first parts of the presentation fairly quickly because I've got a lot of different voices coming from the women participants that I really want to foreground. So first of all, the context of our study are the shocking levels of gender-based violence across Australian institutions, regions, and communities, and also the knowledge emerging from research that higher levels of gender inequalities are also connected with higher levels of gender-based violence. The context of higher education and its commitment to gender equity is connected to the United Nations Sustainable Goal 5 to reach gender equality. And in this way, universities are challenged to understand and respond to the significance of gender-based violence. In 2017, the Australian Human Rights Commission produced the report Change the Course, which aimed to provide an accurate picture of the nature and extent of sexual assault harassment at universities, and also how universities might respond to these incidents. And yet, despite ongoing commitment to equity in higher education and growing recognition of the high prevalence of gender-based violence, there's little understanding of how experiences of gender-based violence affect higher education access and participation. There is, though, a very strong policy commitment in Australia to student equity. And this policy commitment focuses on the access, participation, and success of three main groups: students from low socioeconomic status backgrounds, regional, remote, and rural students, students from regional, rural, and remote backgrounds, and Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander students. But there's little engagement with gender within student equity policy outside of attention to the category women in non-traditional areas of study. There is, though, growing recognition within universities that gender binarization is flawed, harmful, and exclusive. But I would argue that this is not yet embedded in student equity structures, support, and practices. And this is together with a strong backlash over several decades against feminist interventions, with discourses, for example, of a crisis of masculinity and the notion of the feminization of higher education, both of which I myself have written and researched about. And these discourses tend to overshadow attention to ongoing gendered inequalities that play out at a number of different levels, including the systematic level of higher education. Also, equity is entrenched in the corporatized, commercialized, neoliberalized university of contemporary times. And that leads to what I call deficit imaginaries. That is, the way we think about equity is entrenched in notions of the individual deficiencies of students from disadvantaged backgrounds. And this also leads to the privileging of evidence-based policy, which focuses on hard data and all that is measurable or observable or things that we can count, which tends to erase from view those aspects of inequalities that are more insidious and less easy to observe or to measure, and tends to marginalize feminist interventions that bring to light the effective embodied lived experiences of multiple forms of inequality. It also tends to focus away from the relationship between the personal and the political, and the ways that personal experiences of inequalities that work at the micro level are always in relation to macro structures and discourses. Gender-based violence is largely a hidden issue, and it has only become more visible in recent years in relationship to sexual violence on campus. And I would argue when it impacts directly on the university in relation to the corporatized university, the commercialized university, where issues around gender equity are most visible when it is about reputation, branding, or league table prestige cultures. We also have currently a tale of two pandemics, and Boxall, Morgan, and Brown suggest that the COVID-19 pandemic appears to have coincided with the onset of physical or sexual violence or coercive control for many women. And I wonder if the COVID pandemic has helped make visible what United Nations women call the shadow pandemic of gender-based violence. And since the onslaught of the COVID pandemic, there's been increased public attention to gender-based violence, with cases of sexual assault brought to light in Parliament, increased and/or exacerbated levels of domestic and family violence, and large-scale protests both in Australia and internationally. So I would suggest that COVID has both brought to light and intensified existing inequalities, including those associated with gender-based violence. In these contexts, how might higher education respond as a public institution? Well, one way that universities are responding is through the Athena Swan framework, which actually I have here from the first page of the website on Athena Swan, the kind of principles and commitments of Athena Swan, which are really sophisticated and are actually embedded in a feminist theoretical framework. For example, working towards cultural change and taking an intersectional approach. However, most regularly, those kinds of frameworks are then translated into the neoliberal corporatized higher education landscape, which tends to leave gendered inequalities in place. So Mereskind argues that there's a perpetuation and reproduction of binary gender discourses. I've argued in my own work that this tends to foster forms of misrecognition, shame, and shaming. And I've argued with Miriam David and Marie-Pierre Moreau that that commitments to gender equity tends to ignore institutionalized sexism and misogynies. So in terms of the study itself, tonight I'm talking about a pilot study. So we're at the pilot study stage with an ongoing commitment to an extensive research agenda. We're examining the under-researched dimension of gender-based violence and its impact on university access and participation. And we want to explore how deficit discourses of equity intersect with problematic discourses of victimhood to reproduce gendered inequalities in higher education, with the problem relocated at individual levels rather than examining, as I said earlier, the relationship between the micro level of personal experience with the macro level of institutionalized inequalities. We look at higher education as a key site of analysis to consider its role in grappling with the deeply entrenched and multi-layered personal and social histories of gender-based violence, which have largely been invisibilized. And we understand higher education as a space of both the social reproduction and the social transformation of complex gendered inequalities. In other words, higher education is complicit in the ongoing reproduction of gendered inequalities, and as such, has a relationship to gender-based violence, but it also can serve as a site of social transformation around challenging gendered inequalities and gender-based violence, and also providing a space of personal transformation. We understand experiences of gender-based violence as continuously resituated within the complex timescapes, drawing on Barbara Adams' work, of both gender-based violence and higher education. These are lifelong and ongoing non-linear experiences of gendered inequalities, including specific incidents of gender-based violence, but ongoing experiences as well across time and space. Sorry, my PowerPoint isn't responding. There we go. So we're working towards in-depth interviews with up to 50 students. So far, we've collected about 25. The students complete a pre-interview questionnaire, and this particular paper draws from 10 interviews with students aged 18 to 30 who identified as female. And we analyze students' lived and embodied experiences of gender-based violence, not in terms of individual overcoming, but of residual, personal, collective, and ongoing dimensions of struggle in navigating complex and multidimensional inequalities in relation both to gender-based violence and higher education participation. These are some demographic details about the 10 students that I'm drawing from in this paper. So we have 7 undergraduates, 3 postgraduates. They're across different campuses of the University of Newcastle with different pathway processes, and their sexual orientation and cultural ethnicity is there too, as well as their employment status. So I now just want to spend some time foregrounding the students' voices about the impact of gender-based violence. So Ellie here talks about shame and silencing. She says, it just brings a lot of shame and guilt on victims because that idea of society, it's victim blaming, it's their fault. So overall, you just don't want to speak up about it. I remember when I was on campus at those times, I was just always on edge. It was really hard to concentrate. It was just like you were there physically to be present, to try and still be there, to persevere. But yeah, on campus, you just felt very isolated. Who are you going to talk to? Who is going to understand this? Where do I get help? Do I have to drop out? What do I have to do? So you just feel confused, isolated, and just ashamed. And Rochelle talks similarly, but she also talks about the importance of collective sharing to make sense of experiences. So she says, I think certainly gendered violence can reduce your confidence. It makes you feel small and stupid, and maybe that you don't want to finish the degree because what good will you be? You know, if you're so dumb, how can you help people? You know, certain experiences made my self-esteem go right down. And it sort of made me think, you know, why am I studying this degree? Like, why? You know, how can I be of any use to anyone? So overcoming that through a really nice social network, it helps to have a good social network, to have shared experiences. Like there's often a time where a bunch of women will be in a room together and then people just start sharing their experiences. And it's always, you know, gendered violence, and everyone goes, yeah, wow, I've been there too, you know? And it's like, that's really bad, isn't it? Like, yeah, it is, but we've got to get through this. Henrietta talks about after COVID, there was more grace. She says, after COVID, I found a lot more lectures showed us students more grace when it came to late assessments or just support in general. They've been really helpful and more encouraging and just telling us to email them more. Because in first year, second year, I don't feel like I was encouraged to reach out as much. But now most definitely, my lecturers have been saying, yep, just message us. Let us know how you're going. Please send us questions because it's your job, our job, which is really refreshing. Whereas Tara says, but I feel like when it's more of an ongoing kind of issue, they don't really understand it past the first assessment or whatever. I just felt like I couldn't bring it up as another reason because they'd be like, oh, well, you said that before. Like when I tried to apply for adverse circumstances, they'd be like, well, this isn't a sufficient reason. And Sully talks about having just to drop the course, and Ellie talks about being at breaking point. Sully says, I think when a course coordinator or your teacher gets told that you've been through 2 sexual assaults and that you're escaping a domestic violence relationship, I think they should feel like they need to do something more than just being like, well, for example, one of my courses now, I've sent like 5 emails being like, this is what's happened, and I still haven't got a response. And I've just been like, okay, I'll just have to drop that one because he's just going to mark me badly and he doesn't understand what's going on. And Ellie says, so you're trying to work out how to exit the situation, but at the same time, you're at breaking point. So mentally, you know, you're just really broken and you're not in that place to do work and you're really just surviving. So really, it's just the best way to describe it is having the floor underneath you ripped out and just falling, but you've got nothing to grab onto. And the students were amazing. They had a lot of very explicit recommendations in their accounts. So one of the things that they said was it would be really helpful to have staff specifically trained to support students through gender-based violence issues. Sully says it would be really good if they had 1 or 2 counselors that were specifically trained and able to counsel people that are going through sexual assault or domestic violence or any sort of thing like that. And Tara says, I guess the way that the uni could probably be a bit better is that the counselors don't really, like they just give some kind of general counseling, like they don't know how to deal with actual issues related to gendered violence. And there was a lot of focus on this idea of collective support. Ellie says support groups, maybe for people who are survivors, they could come together, discuss their experiences and how they're moving forward, and having that opportunity. If you come forward and you say, look, you know, my studies are severely impacted because of X, Y, and Z, then being able to put a plan in place for you to help you navigate that. And universities could also help foster greater knowledge, awareness, and understanding, the students have said. So Rochelle says, it was also a little bit challenging for a lot of people because we went to this consent matters workshop and we learned a lot about the truth of, you know, sexual abuse and, you know, emotional manipulation and then blackmailing, that sort of thing. And a lot of women realized that they had been abused or assaulted or wrongly treated or, you know, manipulated or are currently being, you know, and it was really hard for a lot of them and, you know, and myself as well. And we just had to wrap our heads around that and sort of I don't know, it wasn't like you had this new identity, but you sort of had this new understanding that being treated this way is not okay. And that's why I feel so horrible, you know, and I shouldn't feel guilty about this because I'm in the right and I've been mistreated. And Tara says, I guess there should be kind of more knowledge about it, especially emotional and verbal and psychological kind of abusive stuff, because I guess people really don't know when that's happening. And I guess more awareness about gender-based violence and like how they have little modules you have to do when you first start uni, that could be one of them. The students also felt more advocacy and awareness could be facilitated by the university. Zara says, I think the more that there's open conversations and advocacy and awareness, the more that we can kind of tackle the issue and make it feel like it's not normal, because it shouldn't be normal, but feel like they can relate a bit more and recognize the issues so that we can call it out. And Ellie says, I suppose sort of like the way they do the consent modules, doing it just domestic violence knowledge, just general education, like what are the forms of violence, but also taking note of maybe just doing some small activities around it, just to sort of show, hey, we don't agree with this. And we also want students and teachers to be aware. So some final reflections, and I've had to cut a lot of the other quotes out because I knew I wouldn't have time to cover all of them. The data that we've collected so far is so rich. So in some final reflections, gender-based violence is a huge issue for Australian society, but is largely invisible in higher education. The pilot study suggests that gender-based violence has a significant impact on higher education access and participation in terms of the women's sense of self-determination, tenacity. It's incredible, actually, in the face of what they've had to be confronted with, their tenacity and their resilience, but also shame, silencing, isolation, lack of resources, support, and safe housing. One of the things that I did have to cut out were some of the slides that were about the risk of homelessness that many of the young women were facing. The nonlinear temporalities that shape survivors' experiences are often out of alignment with the hegemonic timescapes of higher education. And that is really important because it's something that is quite invisible and it's not measurable, but it really does affect how students are able to navigate both their experiences of gender-based violence and surviving, but also of higher education. The students identified very strongly the need for counselors and navigators with particular expertise in gender-based violence. Some of them had counseling outside of university, but those counselors weren't able to help them navigate the university experience and were still then at risk of dropping out of university. COVID-19 was not a salient theme in their accounts, interestingly, but I do think that it has made gender-based violence more visible and has helped actually to do this research. And higher education is significant for the young women's lives in all sorts of ways, but they also identify the role of higher education in raising awareness more broadly and in challenging gender-based violence as part of its commitment to gender equity, which I think is really important. So this is a pilot study at the moment, and it's a project that we are extending and building on to continue to understand the relationship between gender-based violence and higher education participation. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Penny. So I'll ask, we've got a couple of questions there, so I might ask one or two now and then save a couple for the thing at the end. I think the first two kind of connect. So there's one about, like, I wonder if you're finding ways to give advice from this research to universities' policies and resources. I suppose that might be a kind of future-oriented question about what you might do with this. But also, have you got any thoughts about how COVID's been impacting on this kind of thing in terms of the move to remote learning and how educational support systems might work in that realm.
Definitely want the research to feed into advice and guidance for universities to better understand their role in both supporting students, but also in challenging gender-based violence more broadly. And I think that there's a connection between those things. The students' accounts already in this pilot study are pointing to some of the things that universities can do that I think are really important. But we hope, of course, to extend that and to be able to develop deeper understanding to help universities understand better what they can do. And then, well, it's interesting about COVID because it didn't come out in any very specific way in the data, aside from the slides that I had there. And that may be because of the living arrangements of the students at the time that we did the interviews. But I would say that definitely we need to be thinking about the relationship between remote learning and where victims of gender-based violence in the home or survivors of domestic violence might be experiencing that in the very spaces in which they're trying to access higher education or access their studies. So it is definitely an issue that we need to be thinking about. And Julia Cook and I and others have been working on research on the relationship between student equity and housing. It's quite interesting, isn't it, Julia, that again didn't emerge in our data in terms of gender-based violence. And I'm not sure if it's because of the nature of the questions, if it's something that needs to be probed more deeply. But I think that other evidence elsewhere would suggest that it's something we do need to be thinking about.
Okay, thank you. So there's other questions there, and I'll come back to them after our next presentation. Thanks. Thanks, Penny. Okay, so now we'll move on to our third speaker, which is Sarah McDonald from the University of South Australia. Sarah's going to talk about successful girls and COVID-19. First in family, girls rearticulating neoliberal notions of success in higher education. Thanks, Sarah.
Thank you. So I wanted to start actually with speaking about one of my participants and just foregrounding her story around what it was like for her to start university as the first person in her family to attend university. So her name was Tia, and in the weeks before she began university, we had a discussion about what she thought it would be like there. And she expected that she would be more independent in terms of study and in terms of transport. And she was really looking forward to meeting new people because she came from a really small faith-based school, and she knew that she'd meet a lot of different people that were kind of different to who she'd grown up with. So when it came time to enroll in her classes, she went to student services for advice and support because she had absolutely no idea how to enroll in subjects, and specifically what subjects within her degree plan she was supposed to enroll in. And so she had help from a student services officer who helped her to choose topics and to create a timetable. But she did enroll late, which meant that quite late in the enrolment period, and so her timetable ended up being spread over 4 days, and it was a little bit all over the place, which she did find, was a bit worried about because she was also casually employed in a 24-hour call centre where she was working about 25 hours a week. So Tia was really optimistic though when she began her classes. However, she soon started failing multiple subjects, and partly due to difficulty navigating the online learning system, she was unaware that there were weekly quizzes in her topic, and so until someone had mentioned not doing well in them, and she realised she'd gone 5 weeks without doing a single quiz because she didn't know that they existed. And then she also discovered about partway through the semester that she was actually enrolled in second year topics, which explained why she was finding them so difficult. And so she was counselled by the course coordinators to drop out of those second year subjects. However, the census date had already passed, so while she did drop out, the topics were included in her university debt and they were recorded on a transcript as withdraw fail. So Tia told me about how she always looked forward to going to her job at the call centre because she felt really confident there and she knew what she was supposed to be doing and she was good at her job. But in contrast, university made her feel anxious, and she consistently wondered if there was something that she was missing. And she specifically said to me, there's a lot of loopholes and things that I feel like are hidden. So Tia told me how she had not expected to feel sad about university, but she also talked about being really grateful to be there. And she was working hard to improve herself by being more organised and motivated. So Tia's story offers some insight into the way that, or some of the ways that class and gendered experiences influence university student identities for the first and family girls in my study. So my research project examined the experiences of 22 first and family girls from diverse schooling sectors in Adelaide, Australia, as they moved from secondary school into their first year of university. For the purposes of my research, first and family students were defined as those who did not have immediate family members who had attended university. So girls who are the first in their family to attend university, or really anyone who is the first in their family to attend, may contend with significant barriers such as financial difficulties, substantial work or family commitments, as well as feeling out of place in the university space. So the research took place as a series of interviews. Initially, the plan was to just interview them over a 1-year period, but I ended up interviewing them over a 2.5-year period. So once while they were in their final year of school, and then twice during their first year of university. And then I ended up interviewing about half of them again near the end of last year. So during the interviews, the participants, or the girls, were asked to talk about their relationships with both their school and university sites, with a focus on how they negotiated gender relations and learner identities in the context of these sites. And so in exploring how first and family girls constructed themselves as university students, I was interested in how they experienced university in ways that are not accounted for in essentializing discourses around the success of girls. And then I became more recently interested in how the pandemic had an effect on that, which I'll get to later in the presentation. Okay. So when I asked the girls in my study what they thought they would be like as university students, they constructed an ideal university student who was independent, organised, social, flexible, and open-minded. That's the kind of person that they all talked about wanting to be. And their ideal university student identity strongly aligned with notions of the female neoliberal subject who was flexible, individualized, resilient, self-driven, and self-made. This ideal student is often referred to in girlhood research as successful girls or can-do girls, as theorized by researchers such as Anita Harris and Jessica Ringrose. Successful girls refers to both the discourse around girls as successful or a finished project, or the winners in comparison to boys. And while certainly the participation of young women in higher education has increased in past decades, the way that girls negotiate that participation differs according to class and gendered experiences. So the successful girls' discourse is being criticised for upholding an uncomplicated trajectory that does not take into account how certain experiences and futures are not equally available to all girls. So the girls in my study took part in university social life, and they kind of understood how things worked as they went along. But this ideal university student, which was so strongly aligned with the successful girls' discourse, was positioned as who they hoped to be. And for those who are less optimistic about their experiences, they also positioned their perceived failures in terms of this ideal university student. So the girls felt really successful when they made new friends, submitted assignments early, or achieved the grades that they were hoping for. But they felt unsuccessful when, like Tia, they missed a quiz or they did not do their readings because there was a lack of clarity regarding course expectations. Some girls blamed the university, yet at the same time, they were often confused as to how other students knew things. For Tia, there was an aspect of university that was future focused and about personal cultivation, so that she often spoke about how she would improve in the future and how she was working to better herself. These encounters work to shape learner identities in terms of the intersection of gender and class. Evidence in my research indicates that first and family girls are complicit in the take-up of neoliberal ideas of individualisation and responsibility, blaming themselves when things go wrong. So during interviews at the end of their secondary school year, I asked the girls what kind of student they thought they would be at university, as I've previously said. And the following answers are typical of the following quotes are typical of some of the answers given. So Ella said, I'll work a bit harder, and since it's going to be something I'm really interested in doing, I think I'll be more involved in the classes as well. Gabby said, hopefully a proactive one, sort of getting on with study and not putting it off till the last minute like you see all over Facebook. And Kendall said, well, self-motivated, because the lecturers will only give you the information. You have to be the one who has to put the initiative in if you want to actually achieve anything. So yeah, I'll just be very determined to get stuff done. So we see here how their answers focus on the ways that they would change as learners, with expectations that they would be more independent, more motivated, and more organised. So I asked them again during their first semester of university to describe their learner identities, and they described themselves, or the identities that they described were, again, quite strongly aligned with this ideal university student and the successful girls discourse. So Ella said, I feel like I'm a lot more focused at uni because I did have all my friends in my classes at school, so it would be a lot more distracting, and I'd leave all my work to the last minute. But now it's kind of like, this is more serious, so I have to be starting my assignments when I get them rather than leaving them till the last minute. And Gabby said, I'm probably a little more proactive or a bit more organised than I was in year 12. And Kendall said, yeah, but if I do well, I know that that's because of my own abilities. Like, you know, they're just there to provide the information. I actually have to do something with it. You feel fulfilled once you do it correctly. So here, the language that they use to describe their university learner identities is similar to the previous slide. And in this sense, they viewed themselves as successful because they were able to engage in those performances. So we see in Kendall's statement that there's a precarious nature, though, of these contradictory performances. So by aligning her learner identity with a neoliberal discourse of individual success and fulfillment, there is also the suggestion that failure resides solely at the fault of the individual. So I later interviewed the girls again at the end of 2020, and I was really interested in how their ideas of what it meant to be successful might have changed. And again, I asked them about when they had felt successful at university. And what really interested me and surprised me was that rather than specifically speak about academic success or specific university-based success, many spoke to me about experiences which had happened outside of university. So Gabby, for example, you can see here with her quote that she found online learning really hard, and she talked about being stuck in her room for 23 hours a day because there was nowhere for her to study. And so then at the end of the first semester of 2020, she decided to drop out of university. And she decided to go to TAFE, which for those not in Australia is like a technical college in Australia. And she took up some TAFE courses that were in the same area as her degree. And she spoke about just that she wanted to keep studying, but she just didn't think she could continue with university under the, I guess, pandemic version of what university was in 2020. And another thing that happened for Gabby is that she started receiving JobKeeper. So for those, again, who aren't in Australia, JobKeeper was the government benefit that came out in 2020. And it was around $1,500 a fortnight, which was made available to people who had lost their jobs or couldn't work due to the pandemic. And for Gabby, this actually proved to be more money than she had ever earned in her life. She was able to use this money to pay outright for her TAFE courses, and she was also able to buy her first car. Which was really interesting because one of her big issues that she spoke about a lot in the previous years was her struggles with money and how much money worried her. And in particular, she spoke a lot about the public transport. She lived quite far out from the city where her university was, and she really struggled to pay for public transport and found it really expensive. And so she spoke to me, rather than talking about specifically university, she spoke to me about how she felt really successful because she was only studying a few hours a week, but getting really high grades in her TAFE course. And because she was able to afford things that had previously been out of reach to her. And making adult decisions in particular made her feel really proud. And she spoke about how she felt like she was an adult for the first time in her life. And then Yvette was another who spoke very much in a similar way. So she had been working 3 jobs and studying a law degree. And she was an incredibly busy student, really having to be very organised around all these jobs that she was working. And so when the pandemic hit, her father, who was the main breadwinner of the family, lost his job, and her mum had to begin working from home. And in her part-time admin job. And Yvette spoke about claiming a hardship fund from her university so that she could organise a laptop for her mum. And she also started contributing the majority of her weekly pay to her family in order to support them financially. And she spoke about, as you see in the quote there, that she was buying groceries, she was buying things for her siblings if they needed anything, and she used her hardship fund money to get her mum a laptop or to organise a laptop for her mum. And she spoke again about feeling really proud that she could make these adult decisions and feeling proud that she was able to support her family while continuing to do quite well at university. And so with both Yvette and Gabby, as for others that I interviewed, they spoke less about their success in academic terms and more in terms of pride of having navigated difficult terrain and making adult decisions. So while in many ways, both Gabby and Yvette still align themselves with the successful girls discourse, particularly in terms of independence and resilience, there was also a sense that they understood the existence of external factors which were impacting them, which was something that I had never seen in any previous interviews. So other girls in the study also struggled immensely with online learning, yet there was little evidence that they blamed themselves for this. They didn't talk about not trying hard enough or having no motivation. Rather, they were able to accept that external factors were in play, which had made their lives harder, something that I hadn't previously seen and was quite different to the example of Tia that I gave at the beginning. So throughout the research, particular intersections of class and gender in terms of subject positioning was evident in the way that change plans and notions of failure were incorporated into constructions of first in family girls' learner identities. The need to navigate different trajectories was experienced in different ways and could either be positive or negative, depending on their levels of social capital. Before the pandemic, I found that neoliberal constructions of success hinged on personal effort and responsibility, such that a lack of success or an inability to navigate toward particular aspirations was internalised into an internal narrative of individual failure. In this way, learner identities were constructed through forms of interpersonal and institutional violence, where there was a misrecognition of the failures of wider social structures. During the pandemic, I've started to see some instances of recognition. And while it remained ultimately their performances in terms of particular attributes of a specific idealized identity that played an important part in their capacity to understand themselves as successful, there was some evidence, or there is some evidence, that these identities could be understood or constructed differently when viewed in the context of wider social experiences. Thank you.
Excellent. Thanks, Sarah. Do we have some questions for Sarah? So a question here is, I'm really interested in the way that the girls re-articulated their learner identities in the COVID context. Is this something that was done in relation to family or university response, or all of the above?
I think that it was a little bit dependent on the girls themselves. So for some of them, it was a bit more about university and others were about family. And so I think mostly it seemed to depend a little bit on what kind of support that they were needing to give their family, as we saw with the vet as well. And yeah, they seem to have an understanding of this as being a wider issue that had affected everybody, including their families. And so it was more difficult for them to place blame on themselves when things didn't go well, because actually they were kind of seeing everybody have bad experiences, I guess. So I think it was, I guess, in relation to both family and that university response as well.
Thanks. We have another question for Sarah. Okay. Was there anything that helps us better to understand how we can support students?
No, I mean, I think what was difficult was that just universally they hated online learning. None of them were positive about it, which kind of surprised me because previously there were some who found going to university really anxiety inducing, and so I wondered if they would find university learning, online learning better, but literally not one single girl I've spoken to so far has been positive about online learning. Partly it was they're feeling disconnected, I think, so not feeling like they were able to have a relationship with their tutors and their lecturers seemed to be a big issue for them. So in terms of that kind of support, but I guess thinking beyond the pandemic, because I think that the pandemic doesn't necessarily cause the problems as kind of shine a light on problems that are existing issues that are already there. I know for myself that I've changed a lot of my own, the way that I teach based on interviewing these girls, because I'll do things now like spend some of my first classes walking them through how to use the learning online systems, talking to them about this is all the work that you need to do, this is where you'll find that work, sending an email out right at the beginning to explain that kind of stuff and not assuming that they know things. And then even small things like showing them how they can find textbooks if they don't have the money to buy them, and making that stuff seem really normal, rather than if you're poor, then this is how you can find this. But if you're struggling to find this, this is how you get it. This is what I did as a student, because, I wasn't a first in family student, but I was from a working class background. So I kind of understand some of those experiences. So I think not making assumptions about what they know, and then also really trying to work hard to work out what you know, but maybe forgot that you learned. And I think that can be a little bit of an issue for them as well, because we kind of forget that we didn't always know these things, and so therefore they're not obvious to students all the time.
Yep. Excellent, thanks. I might get Penny to come back online as well, and we can open it up for a more general discussion if we have those questions. I can go back to a couple from before. So Penny, one question that was asked after yours has got a bit to do with some of the concepts. So can you say a little bit more about hegemonic timescapes and multiple temporalities?
Yeah, I don't think I said multiple temporalities. I think I said multidimensional inequalities. But so let me just say something about timescapes, which is really trying to understand that we experience the world in terms of both time and space. And we often think about higher education, for example, as a landscape, and we paint a picture of a landscape without understanding the temporal experiences of higher education, which are constructed around particular notions of time as kind of chronological, as linear, as kind of unidirectional, rather than multi-directional kind of flows of time. And the way that we experience I guess multiple timescapes as we're navigating these different aspects of and dimensions of our lives. And I think for this research, it's very useful concept, because the disorienting and nonlinear experiences of gender-based violence are often treated as if it's about a moment in time, an incident, something that happened at a particular time. And that's kind of how we understand and imagine time in higher education. We manage our time. We structure time around semesters, terms, weeks, deadlines, and so on. So when we have mechanisms in place to support students around adverse circumstances, there's a misalignment around the temporal inequities that shape our experiences of higher education and gender-based violence. So just to say, I suppose the timescapes of gender-based violence are not just one moment in time. It's quite interesting that from our all the students completed questionnaires, and the young women started experiencing gender-based violence in their lives from as young as 9. Most of them from under the age of 12, and almost all of them from under the age of 15 and onwards. And so, these are not just incidents or just a moment in time. They're ongoing kind of residual struggles in navigating processes of survival and also of accessing and participating in higher education. So that's a very long-winded answer, but I think we're just
really.
shed light on that sort of complexity around how time is experienced so differently from the kinds of mechanisms and structures of time that are most familiar to us in higher education and the way we structure student support, teaching and learning and so on, assessment and so on.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yes.
And there was another question at yours as well about is the research is it only done at University of Newcastle? And the question's because in the posters experience, universities can and do provide many of these services that students are looking for, but they are not very good at promoting them effectively, and students don't tend to know where they are.
Yeah, so the pilot study is based at the University of Newcastle. I think that there's two things there. I think one is that as one of the students pointed to, the provision of a person who could help navigate complex university systems would be really, really useful. I mean, I am the director of the Center of Excellence for Equity in Higher Education, and I still don't know all of the different support provision available to students. And I don't think any of us do in our universities because they are so complex. And so having people who have the expertise to navigate the university on behalf of students is a very useful kind of mechanism to do that. But I think the other thing that the students were saying is that although there is counseling and that is very appreciated and very valuable, the general nature of that counseling sometimes undermines the support that's intended to be given because there isn't the expertise around gender-based violence. And that actually means that either they're either turned away and it's suggested that they go see an expert somewhere else who has that knowledge to be able to support them effectively, or the support is very short term and it isn't actually meeting their needs. So, I mean, that's just one example of student support. Counseling isn't the only thing, but I think it's an important one that shows that the expertise is really required to actually speak to the relationship between higher education and gender-based violence.
Thanks. There's a comment here. It's interesting because one argument on why neoliberalism is so powerful is that alternatives seem outdated and belonging to the 70s. With the moratorium described, will they just bounce back to previous neoliberal dispositions once all this kind of state support is gone? Do you think you could address that?
Both of us.
Sarah, I think, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like even the kind of moratorium that I've described is so small at this point that I couldn't even say they've stopped positioning themselves in terms of these neoliberal identities, but rather that there was a chink in the armor, I think, and so which gave me some hope. But yeah, I absolutely think that very quickly they will bounce back into these kind of successful girls discourses or positioning themselves against that kind of discourse. And I think as well that discourse is so prevalent and so strong that it's really difficult for them to see that it exists and that that's the kind of work that they're doing on themselves. And I think a lot of people see it that way as well. I mean, there's still a lot of discourse around that girls don't need help, or if they do need help, it's all in terms of science kind of thing. And what's really interesting, I do have one girl in the study who is in science and has joined up in some of the like women in STEM types of clubs, and is just having a terrible time in it because everybody has money and she doesn't. And every time she goes to any networking event, the questions asked her around like, you know, where have you been in the world and what have you, and she's saying, I've not been out of the state, like I've never been anywhere, these questions aren't for me, I've never eaten this kind of food before, that kind of thing. So yeah, she's someone who does show a lot of awareness, but even then when there is this specific support around women in terms of women in STEM, even that support is incredibly neoliberalized in terms of how that's all positioned, really.
Okay, we have a couple more questions coming in. So this one's for Sarah. What concepts or theories did you use in your study? And also, were there any first in family girls who identified from migrant backgrounds, and did their experiences differ?
Yep. So the main concepts and theories, I was using Judith Butler for theories around performativity, and Bourdieu in terms of looking at social class and habitus and that kind of thing. And then I also drew a lot on Beverly Skegg's work. So she's looked a lot at women in working class areas and how they positioned themselves. And so I drew on her work a lot as well. And then the successful girls work that I didn't really come up until during my, I hadn't really planned to necessarily use that stuff when I first started the research, but I just saw so many examples of the way the girls spoke about themselves and the way they constructed identities that I then did a huge amount of reading around people who were working within successful girls' discourses. And a lot of that work's been done in primary schools and high schools, but I haven't really seen much that's happened in a university sense. And so I found it very, very interesting and fascinating that the girls were continuing to work in that kind of way at university as well. And in terms of migrant backgrounds, there were quite a few in the study. So about a third were from migrant backgrounds, and they mostly did position themselves against the same kind of discourse, but at the same time, they all had been in Australia for the majority of their lives. So most of them had either been born in Australia or had moved to Australia at a very, very young age. And so I think that a lot of the way they thought around success at university was kind of in those terms. At the same time, there was one girl in particular who was from a refugee background who lived with her uncle and auntie. And it was her uncle that had been the one who really pushed for her to go to university, and he broke down a lot of gender stereotypes for her because he was working as a nurse, and so she very much saw that he was this, man who had these terrible experiences in his home country, who would come here and wasn't kind of signing up for specific gendered ways of being male in Australia, and that did inspire her a lot, I think, to not necessarily see herself that way. But yeah, mostly they still did kind of position themselves really similarly as the girls who went from migrant backgrounds.
Okay. Also for Sarah, did any of the participants discuss how gender or gender expectations roles might have influenced their work and how that impacted their ability to support themselves or their family during university? And that is the type of work that they had access to.
Yeah, so not so much the type of work that they had specifically had access to, other than that there were some girls who there were very high expectations around helping a lot in the home and doing a lot of childcare. And so for some of them, it was more that they didn't have time to work as much as they would want to because they were helping in the home. And one girl in particular, that was because her own mum had started going to university at the same time as her. And so they had worked out their whole timetable around who could be at home with the younger children and who would be at university. But it was interesting because it was quite a powerful thing in their family as well to go through that experience. But certainly they did talk a lot around gender expectations in terms of future roles. So I did talk to them about whether or not they thought that they had chosen particular degrees based on their gender, and probably about half of them said that they were aware that they probably had gone in a certain direction based on stereotypes. The girl who was one of the girls who was in science had specifically chosen her degree partway through to go into a biology area because she had been given that advice based on the fact that she was a girl. And then also what they did speak about a lot was the influence that their mums had had on them in terms of making decisions and going to university in the first place. So quite a few of them weren't very interested in university, but their mums basically forced them to go and were like, I didn't get to go, I didn't get to have this kind of experience, so you have to go and do it in my place, kind of thing. So yeah.
Okay. And the last question that we have there at the moment, so if there is any other questions to come, please get them up there. I'm interested in the language around futures and aspirations, and this is to you again, Sarah. I noted that one of your participants spoke about her goals, and I was wondering if this was prevalent, that uni was about goals rather than being, for example, intrinsically exciting, inspiring, things like that.
Yeah, I think there was a lot of talk around goals, but it did differ between a lot of the girls. So for some of the girls, their goal or their big aspiration in life wasn't a career, but to get to university. So they would talk about, when I interviewed them the first time after they'd started university, they would talk about, I've reached all my goals in life, like I've made it here. And those girls seemed better, or I want to say better able, but they seemed to be, they enjoyed the experience of being university students, and that was really exciting to be there. And they talked to me all about the things that they did there and the friends they were making. Whereas there were others who spoke about goals in terms of a career or in terms of finishing university and moving on to that next part of their life. And for some of them, university did seem to be about a means to an end and about a little bit of a drudgery. But I was really interested in the ones who spoke about university itself, or reaching university as the goal, because it was a bit different to some of the research that suggested that working class people go to university just to get the degree so they can get the good job. That wasn't probably half the girls in my study, that wasn't how they spoke, and it was like they wanted to have the university experience, and that was really important to them. And so they did talk about success in terms of, I'm successful because I joined a club, or I'm successful because I made friends and I study with them, not I got really high grades necessarily.
Can I just add to that, Steve, and say that a lot of the participants in the study, including but not only the 10 women that this paper was focused on, talk about their participation in higher education being very much driven by social justice pursuits and wanting to make a difference for particularly other women. And other research I've done recently has also suggested that students from working class backgrounds in particular are very driven by other kinds of aspirations to do with making a difference to their communities and participating in university for the better good. Although, career and their own personal aspirations are also part of that, but not kind of the main driver, most of the data suggests. So I just wanted to reinforce what Sarah just said.
Yeah, I completely agree with that, Penny, and that was definitely very prevalent in my research as well.
Cool. Okay, well, that seems like a good point to wrap it up. So thanks to all the presenters we had today, Penny, Sarah and Jenny. And thanks for everyone that came along. Really appreciate it at the end of the long working day for everyone, or in the UK, very early in the morning. So we'll be having quite a few more of these. We're planning them out over the rest of the semester. So keep a lookout for that on social media. And also we have an email list. If you're not on it, please send me an email, Stephen Threadgold, and I can put you on that, and you can get our various PR related stuff as we send it out. So again, thanks a lot, and I'll see you next time. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you for your great presentations.
Thank you so much.